thank you. Thank you all for coming out today, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here at the St. Lawrence County Historical Association at the Silas Wright House, a building that is steeped in the history of St. Lawrence County, the North Country, and New York State. And it's so wonderful to see so many people who share my interest in North Country history. So many people grow up today thinking that history is something that happens somewhere else, when actually history is something that happened all around us, and it's our responsibility to make the current generation and future generations aware of just what a historic area northern New York is. If you would, I'd like you to step back in time with me to 1920. The U.S. Congress and the states have ratified the 18th Amendment prohibiting possession, manufacture, distribution of alcoholic beverages. The case whiskey makers and beer makers have taken into court. It has gone through all the different levels of the courts, and the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that it's legal, that if the Congress and the legislatures of the states have determined that this is a law that they want to make the law of the land, that they have that power to put it into effect. And in June of 1920, it's a late evening, and two sailors are staggering through the streets of Ogdensburg, and they stagger down to the waterfront to the tugboat where they've been working, and they, please welcome.
Thank you.
And they stagger down to the tugboat that they've been working on, and fall asleep on the dock. And later that night, there's a loud splash, and there's cries for help, and the captain of the tugboat is wakened, and people in the area are come to the scene, and one of the two sailors is in the water clutching the pier underneath the dock, and the other sailor can't be found. The police conduct an investigation after they find the body of the second sailor who drowned that night. And in the newspaper, there's an article about how these three sailors had earlier in the evening been to three different establishments where they bought liquor and drinks. And that week, George Darrow, the editor of the Advance, which was one of a couple of newspapers in Ogdensburg at the time, published an article in which he asked the question, why is it that if the law of the land is to prohibit the distribution and manufacture of alcohol, why is it that these two sailors were able to go to three different establishments, and if the police were able to find this information out, why is it that they haven't done anything about it? Well, the Ogdensburg Journal, which was one of the other newspapers in town, asked the question to the police chief. Why is it that this could happen? What are you doing about it? Isn't there this prohibition law in effect? And the police chief says, well, you just can't expect us to be enforcing that law. That, you know, we've got so much to do. We're so understaffed. There's, you know, this is a federal law. This was passed by the federal government. You know, the federal authorities need to do something about this. So they asked the assistant district attorney, William Ingram, who's, you know, well known that he was getting ready to launch his run for St. Lawrence County District Attorney, an elected position. They asked him, you know, you're the district attorney, you're in charge of prosecuting crimes and enforcing the law. What are you doing about this? He said, you know, we're just so busy. You know, we got so much going on. You know, we just don't have the resources. You know, this is really the federal government's responsibility. Well, at that time in 1920, if you've ever been to Ogdensburg, you've ever been on State Street to the U.S. Post Office, back in 1920, it was also the U.S. Courthouse. It had the U.S. Marshal's office, it had the Customs Service there, it had the U.S. Magistrate's office, and it had the U.S. Attorney's office. And the U.S. Attorney at the time, who was in charge of enforcing the federal laws from all the way from Binghamton to northern New York, was a gentleman by the name of Dennis Lucy, who was an appointee by President Wilson to enforce the federal laws throughout upstate New York. And he was a former mayor of Ogdensburg, and he was reading these articles in the newspaper and seeing these people pointing the fingers at the federal government, and he took it kind of personally and, you know, felt that they were sort of suggesting that it was his fault. So he called in couple of the newspaper reporters and issued a lengthy statement that, you know, communities across New York State were enforcing this law, that his office had prosecuted successfully a couple hundred bootleggers, speakeasy operators, and people who were producing alcohol and smuggling it in. And he made the observation that it seemed to him that the Ogdensburg police, the only thing that they were doing was running to get out of the way of the bootlegger cars that were tearing down 4th Street on their way to other places. And he said that if, you know, the city police department and the county assistant district attorney were unfamiliar with their jobs and incapable of doing their jobs, that he would be happy to instruct them on what to do and how to do it. But if they really weren't interested in enforcing the prohibition laws, they should just say that and not try to point the fingers at others. Well, the newspapers enjoyed pointing, you know, this tit for tat going on among the public officials, and the Messina newspaper, watching all this, made the observation, does St. Lawrence County even have a sheriff? We haven't heard from the sheriff. We haven't seen any sign of him enforcing these laws. If it's true that everyone else is so busy, isn't the sheriff responsible for enforcing laws here in St. Lawrence County? Well, while all this was going on, the U.S. Attorney wrote to the Justice Department, to his superiors, the U.S. Attorney General, and said, here we are on the Canadian border. We need more resources here. There's a great deal of smuggling that is happening, and if we're going to get any kind of control over the problem, we are going to need more resources. Well, he didn't hear anything for a while until there was an incident that happened where 12,000 quarts of liquor were found on a ship on the St. Lawrence River that was docked at Cardinal, Ontario. And a lot of the liquor had been unloaded and was being hauled through the streets of Ogdensburg. And the Canadian customs authorities, when they were alerted to this and went to investigate and found all this liquor aboard, and they looked at the ship's manifest and they found that the ships had said that they were hauling a load of coal, and they saw that these were in quart bottles.
Still would burn though, right?
Maybe, the ship was seized and padlocked, and all the liquor was, taken out and brought to the Prescott Town Hall and locked inside. And there were news articles around the U.S. that all this liquor was being, brought into the U.S. and, no one seemed to be, paying attention to what was happening on the river and on the border. And, with stories in the New York City papers and papers around the country about this incident, the Attorney General could see that maybe there really was a problem up there. And so day came when the New York Central Railroad train arrived in Ogdensburg, and 4 gentlemen got off the train, and they took a stroll through the community and stopped in at a few places, and then continued on to the what's now the post office, which back then was the U.S. courthouse, and appeared in front of the U.S. magistrate and got warrants, and soon showed up at the Oswegatchie Hotel, which was a little hotel at the corner of Main Street and Water Street in Ogdensburg. Some of you who are older may remember Chapel's Hotel in Ogdensburg. Well, back then it was known as the Oswegatchie Hotel. It's not there anymore, it later burned. But they went into the Oswegatchie Hotel and arrested the owner and seized the bar, and it found that they were operating a full-scale bar, just as if Prohibition had never actually been passed. And they had all kinds of high-quality wines and liquors, and just cases and cases of liquor and everything else you can imagine. And they took possession of that. Then they went and they visited the LaSalle lunchroom on 4th Street, which was just, a couple hundred feet from the Ogdensburg police station. And the doors were padlocked. Even though they'd been there earlier in the day and had made some purchases of liquor. And but while they were raiding the Oswegatchie Hotel, the owner of the lunchroom had packed up his stuff and skedaddled home to his house on Tate Street, where they went and found him with his liquor and seized it and him. And his 8 children watched as their dad was taken before the U.S. magistrate. That right around that same time, a 200-foot ship pulled in, a U.S. Coast Guard ship, with 2 6-pound cannons on it, with a crew of around 50 to 70 sailors. And shortly after that, 2 small gunboats of about 80 feet each, with crews of 10 on board each one, arrived with 1-pound cannons. And the U.S. Attorney, Dennis Lucy, called the press in and said, everyone's been asking for the federal government to respond. Well, we're here. We have these 4 federal agents, who are currently visiting some of these businesses that have been operating in violation of the law. We now have these gunboats and a former naval ship that's been turned into a Coast Guard vessel, and it is going to patrol the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. And we want to send a message to all the smugglers and all the bootleggers and all the speakeasy operators that we're here, and your time of flouting the new federal laws are over. You wanted the federal government? Well, we're here. Well, not long afterwards, 2 ministers from Potsdam came to visit the federal agents who had set up shop in the federal building, and they were very, very, very upset. They explained to the federal agents that they had done numerous sermons from their pulpits, making their congregations aware of the evils and dangers of alcohol. And that, they had told them, you cannot be a good Christian just by coming to church on Sunday if the other 6 evenings you're patronizing these illegal gin joints and speakeasies in the village of Potsdam. And they made the offer to the agents, come to Potsdam, help us clean up our village. We've tried. We have named names from the pulpit, and these people are just so brazen, they just continue on, and no one is doing anything about it. And we need you to come to Potsdam. And, the federal agent said, that's what we're here for. We're here to help. And the ministers said, but there's one condition. We want to go with you on the raids. We want to go into those evil speakeasies and see the look on their faces when you arrest them and, show them the righteous path that they need to follow. And the federal agent said, hey, come on with us. Great, we'll go. Well, so they went to Potsdam and made some visits, and then went back to the U.S. magistrate, got warrants, and then came back and raided a couple of speakeasies in Potsdam. And the ministers were quite happy that they were able to strike a blow for godliness and brought God's law to Potsdam, either the place that it was. And not long after that, the sheriff, Lawrence Fishbeck, and some people have questioned whether we even had a sheriff. Well, the sheriff and the district attorney and the assistant district attorney showed up with 10 or 20 deputies and constables in pirates. And pirates in those days had a thriving mining village, and on Friday at the end of the day, the liquor was on full display until the sheriff and the district attorney and their officers of law showed up and began piling it all into their trucks along with the operators, and put an end to this rampant criminality running through the good village of Pirates, the hamlet. Well, it wasn't long after that, in Messina, the chief of the Messina Police Department, who was also employed by Alcoa, he had been strictly enforcing this new law. And he had won a lot of respect and admiration from people because, unlike Ogdensburg, he was taking this new law seriously and was cracking down on these people who were flouting the new federal law. And this one day, a load of liquor it was in a car, and it was running at high speeds through the village of Messina. And he had been tipped off about it. And the Messina police chased after the vehicle, and he led them on a high-speed chase through the village of Messina. And unfortunately, it had outrun them and had continued on heading toward Ogdensburg. And the chief, called the Ogdensburg police and gave them a description of the vehicle and told them that they need to be on the lookout because this vehicle was heading their way. Well, the sergeant was on duty at the time in the old Opera House, where City Hall is now, but back then it had a beautiful opera house that later burned and was replaced by the current City Hall. Well, the sergeant was hanging out with one of the sheriff's deputies, and they decided to set up a roadblock where the road comes into by the psychiatric center, and so they waited for these bootleggers who were heading their way. Well, sure enough, the bootleggers showed up, but the officers were there standing in the road, and they commanded the car to stop, and the bootlegger just headed right toward them. And they had to jump out of the way in order to avoid being hit, and the bootlegger continued on into Ogdensburg with the officers in hot pursuit, firing their weapons. But the bootleggers were able to get away and fled through the city and continued on in the direction of Watertown. So the Ogdensburg police called Watertown and said, this vehicle, they made it through Messina, led the police on high-speed chase, came to Ogdensburg, nearly killed a couple of officers. We fired at them. They did not pull over. They got through. They're heading toward Watertown. You need to be, here's a description of the vehicle. You need to be on the lookout. They're heading your way. Well, the Watertown police chief told his officers, you be on the lookout for this vehicle. They may have gotten through Messina, they may have gotten through Ogdensburg. This is Watertown, and we're gonna show them. Well, sure enough, one officer is on his walking beat in Public Square in Watertown. This is before Route 81's was built. The roads come into Watertown, go through Public Square, and head out from there. And this officer sees this vehicle matching the description, and but he's on foot, and he runs to the taxi stand, and he jumps onto the side of the exterior of the taxi stand. He's standing on the floorboards and hanging on to the outside of the taxi. He says, follow that car. And the taxi driver begins a high-speed chase through the city of Watertown, and over on Flower Street and around and about, and pulls up alongside this fleeing bootlegger. And the officer, as the two vehicles are racing along, and they're only a very short distance apart, the officer leaps onto the other vehicle, lands on the floorboards, clutches it, draws his pistol, and orders the driver to pull over, and takes them into custody. And which sort of gives you an idea of just how seriously some of the officers were taking this law, and some of the lengths to which some of them would go to enforce the national prohibition laws. Now, some of you may be familiar with our former Assemblywoman, Dee Dee Scozzafava. Her grandfather, Fred Scozzafava, grew up in Chattagay, and then his family moved to Governor, and there came a day where Fred was hauling a load of liquor from the border, heading for Governor. And he was driving through DeKalb Junction. Some of you, I'm sure, have been to DeKalb Junction. And as he was driving through, the New York Central Railroad train crashed into him.
Oh no.
And he got a broken leg, and according to the news reports, when the sheriff's deputies arrived and took Fred and his friend into custody, every bottle in the vehicle had been broken. Now, whether or not there were other bottles before the police arrived that they weren't clear on that, but it was clear that Fred was hauling a substantial quantity, and he was taken to what was at Hepburn Hospital for treatment for his leg. And when I found out about this, I reached out to Dee Dee Scozzafava, and I said, are you aware, of this? And Dee Dee asked her father, who was still living at the time. He passed on last year. And she said that when she asked about it, he lit right up and said, oh yeah, it's true. Yeah, your grandfather, oh yeah, he was a big bootlegger. That's just one. That's the time he got caught, And he went to his desk and he looked through stuff, and he pulled out a picture of his dad on crutches in front of this crumpled up vehicle that had been the vehicle he was driving when the New York Central Railroad train had crashed into it. And he had kept this picture proudly throughout his lifetime. And they shared it with me so I could include it in my book. And Fred did not take it well that the New York Central crashed into his car. So he sued the New York Central. And we don't know what the outcome of that lawsuit was because they reached a settlement that was sealed. However, shortly after that, Fred opened a chain of auto parts stores across northern New York. And Fred later was the only person from St. Lawrence County invited to Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration. So,
All is forgiven.
all is forgiven, and, Prohibition harms some people, helps some people, and some people, while Grandpa may not have told everybody all about every thing that happened during those days. For some families in the North Country, it was a great opportunity to make money. It was a source of enduring embarrassment for many families that members of their families were involved in such activities. Some of you may have, at one time or another, been to Philip's Diner in Ogdensburg. The ancestor of, Joe Reagen, who was the founder of the founder of Philip's Diner, was one of Ogdensburg's best known. In his obituary, they called him a mixologist. And once liquor became legal again, they advertised, that one of the city's most famous mixologists was tending bar at the one of the hotels in town. And but Joe had a colorful career. First he was operating a speakeasy over by the New York Central Railroad depot in Ogdensburg until he got arrested for that. Then he was operating another speakeasy at the old Union Hotel, which was at the corner of State Street and Lafayette Street, now known as Nick's, and he was raided there. He popped up again with another speakeasy at the corner of Ford Street and Patterson Street at the Johnson House. He even, one night in March, they used to have a giant soiree at the New York State Armory in Ogdensburg. And it was the night of Mardi Gras, the night before Lent begins, and they would have a major party, and Joe was arrested when he accidentally crashed his car into 3 vehicles that were parked in front of the armory. And apparently had a load of liquor that he was bringing into the Spike the Drinks at the party at the armory.
He must have tested it, huh?
I think he had tested quite a bit of it prior to it and found it good. The owners of the vehicles, though, did not find it quite as wonderful that Joe was busy testing it for their safety and the safety of others. Those are just a handful of some of the incidents that occurred during the first year of Prohibition. Prohibition went for 12 years, and as you can imagine, there were people who were less than impressed at the idea of giving up their toddies just because Congress and the state legislatures had decided to go in with this whole temperance idea. And over the course of the 12 years, within a short time after that first year, it got more violent, not just here in the North Country, but around the country. And we saw the rise of organized crime and a lot of violent episodes on both sides as the country wrestled with the battle. I'm currently working on another volume in what I intend to make a series on Prohibition, and I'll just talk about one incident in Madrid. Some gangsters from Brooklyn came up and leased a cheese plant in Madrid, and they told the owner that they'd be working mainly at night because they had perfected a secret recipe for making cottage cheese from skim milk, and they didn't want anyone finding out about their secret recipe. So part of the recipe called for smuggling loads of liquor bottles across the St. Lawrence River and then transporting it to Madrid, where they would load the bottles into big metal milk containers, and then they would stuff cottage cheese over the top, and also to act as a cushion for the bottles to keep them from being broken. And then they would ship the metal containers on the railroad down to Brooklyn. And Sam Adamson, who was one of the mobsters from Brooklyn, thought that this was greatest idea ever. He's in Madrid. The farmers are happy to sell their milk. The gentleman who owns the cheese plant is happy to lease his facility to these gentlemen from Brooklyn. He's found people with checkered past from Messina who are happy to help them transport alcohol across the river. Everything's going great until one night the sheriff's department and a large group of constables arrive at the cheese plant and seize the liquor and catch all of them. And one of the gentlemen from Messina escapes. He's with his handcuffs on, makes it to the graveyard in Madrid, where he saws the handcuff chain on a gravestone and then smashes it with a stone, and then makes it to Messina, where the Messina police chief is waiting for him, and takes him into custody and brings him back. All them are held in the Madrid hotel. Sam also manages to escape, hides in a barn till sunlight, and hires a farmer to drive him to Messina, where the police are waiting for him, and they are eventually they're released on bond and then heavily fined by the U.S. court. Sam decides that maybe Madrid isn't the place for him in the future. And he and several other Brooklyn gangsters decide to head to Detroit, where they join the Purple Gang, which was a organized crime group that supplied liquor to Al Capone's mob in Chicago. And they would also conduct kidnappings, robberies, extortion, and rented themselves out as hitmen and executioners for the Capone mob and other mobs. When you needed someone murdered, the Purple Gang would send someone in to commit the murder in another city where no one knew the members of the Purple Gang, and that way the mob, whatever criminals you were sent in to kill, they wouldn't know it was you, and they wouldn't know who had brought you in to commit the murder. Well, Sam, of course, later was dying in a hail of bullets at a restaurant in downtown Detroit, and his killer was executed a short week or so later, and the Detroit police said that his body was dumped a short distance from Sam's house as a message that the Purple Gang was unhappy with someone killing one of their members. So the point is that St. Lawrence County had a very colorful history during Prohibition. It had a lot of very colorful characters. I would like to thank all of you for coming out today. I appreciate you showing this interest. I think that we who live here in St. Lawrence County owe it to our own families and future generations to let people know that history really happened here, and it's all around us, and it's worth preserving. So thank you all for coming out today, and I'll take any questions if you'd like. Go ahead.
What were they using to ferment or whatever in their stills to make it?
What were they using?
I mean, were they using hops? Were they using,
Well, you know, a lot of the smuggling that was going on, Canada would allow you to buy liquor as long as you were bringing it into the U.S. So you could buy high quality, well-known brands of liquor in Canada and bring it to the U.S., and it would command a high price in the U.S. And if you could transport it to New York City or to any of the urban areas, it would command a really high price because it tasted a lot better than the home brewed stuff, you know, and it had been aged and, you know, gone through the quality control measures that liquor makers had at the time. And so, you know, while there certainly were people who used stills like that one, it was a whole lot simpler a lot of times to just take your boat, row it across the St. Lawrence, pop into various places, load up your boat, and bring it back, load it in your car, and head to wherever it was you were going to sell it. Some of you may have, at one time or another, seen the Blue Church Cemetery in Maitland, Ontario. Persis Boyesen, the late historian for Ogdensburg and Hewelton, told me that some of the gravestones in the Maitland Cemetery, which is right there next to the shore, had metal plaques on them telling you who it was that the gravestone, whose grave it was. But you could unscrew these metal plaques, open the metal plaque, and the tombstone, the gravestone, was hollow. And they would fill up the gravestone with liquor, put the metal back on top, and that night somebody would row over from the Ogdensburg side of the river and go unscrew it and unload all the liquor out of the gravestone, build their boat, and head back over. So they were quite imaginative. Good.
I'm just curious, I don't know if you, what was happening in the country in 1920 that the government thought this was a great idea?
Well, you have to remember, the temperance movement came out of the women's suffrage movement, came out of, you know, it had been part of the anti-slavery movement in the early 1800s. And there was a belief that the social ills of the country could be addressed through legislation, and people's behaviors could be changed by the stroke of a pen of the government. And the editor of the Advance, George Darrow, was firmly convinced that prohibition would end crime, end domestic abuse, end reduce poverty, and bring a new era of better living for everyone if they could just eradicate demon run.